The Academy of Convergent Arts stood as a testament to galactic cooperation, its crystalline spires reaching toward 3 different suns that painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. Within its halls, the finest young minds from 17 different species gathered to master the ancient crafts that had shaped civilization across the stars. Today, Master Thekvar's metalworking class buzzed with anticipation. "Today, you will demonstrate your worthiness to advance," the Zephyrian instructor announced, his 4 arms gesticulating as bioluminescent patterns flickered across his scaled hide. "You must forge a blade, not merely any cutting implement, but a weapon that speaks to your soul, your heritage, your understanding of what it means to create." His primary eyes swept across the diverse assembly, while his secondary pair monitored the fusion forges that hummed with barely contained stellar fire. The students nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Cuthrax, whose chitinous exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, flexed his razor-sharp mandibles in what passed for a smile among the hive-born. His people had been crafting bioweapons for millennia before other species had discovered fire. Velnara, her 6-fingered hands already dancing through preparatory gestures, represented the artisan caste of Helios Prime, where metallurgy was considered the highest form of spiritual expression. The young granite lords from Kepler's crown stood like living boulders, their stone-like skin naturally resistant to heat, making them ideal smiths. And then there was David Thompson. The human sat quietly in the back corner, his unremarkable appearance drawing occasional glances of poorly concealed disdain. At 22 standard years, he was considered barely past adolescence by galactic standards, yet somehow he had earned a place in this prestigious academy. Most of his classmates assumed it was some form of diversity initiative. Humans were, after all, the newest species to achieve interstellar capability, their crude chemical rockets having only recently been replaced with proper fusion drives. "You have until the 3rd sun sets," Master Thekvar continued, his voice carrying the authority of one who had forged weapons for the Imperial Guard. "Your materials await at your assigned stations. Choose wisely, for your selection will be as telling as your craftsmanship." The great forge hall erupted into motion. Students rushed to examine their options: rare metals from the core worlds, crystalline matrices that could hold plasma edges, exotic alloys that existed only in the hearts of neutron stars. The granite lords selected chunks of their homeworld's living stone, which would respond to their bioelectric fields. Cuthrax immediately began secreting the organic polymers his species used to grow their weapons. Velnara gathered atmospheric processors and gravity hammers, preparing to craft something that would have made her ancestors weep with pride. David walked slowly to his station, seemingly oblivious to the controlled chaos around him. His assigned materials were, by galactic standards, primitive: various terrestrial metals, basic carbon composites, and a selection of what the Academy catalog generously termed traditional elements. He examined each option with the methodical patience of someone who had learned not to rush, his calloused hands, scarred from countless hours in his grandfather's workshop back on Earth, testing weight and texture. Then he saw it. Tucked behind a container of titanium alloy samples sat a chunk of flint, roughly the size of his fist. According to the Material Index, it had been included as a cultural artifact from humanity's pre-industrial period. Most students would have overlooked it entirely, dismissing it as a relic from a less enlightened time. David picked it up, feeling its weight, running his thumb along its edges where previous students had chipped away small pieces for anthropological studies. Around him, the other students had begun their work in earnest. Velnara's station glowed with the contained fury of a miniature star as she sang the traditional forging hymns of her people. Cuthrax worked in meditative silence, his hands moving in patterns that had been encoded in his genetic memory. The granite lords had begun their slow, powerful strikes, each blow timed to resonate with their homeworld's seismic rhythms. Master Thekvar made his rounds, offering guidance where needed, his approval or concern evident in the shifting patterns of his bioluminescence. When he reached David's station and saw the human simply sitting there, holding a piece of stone, his pattern shifted to what those familiar with Zephyrian body language would recognize as barely contained exasperation. "Student Thompson," Tekvar said, his translator rendering his natural harmonic vocalizations into standard galactic, "perhaps you misunderstood the assignment. You are to forge a blade, not conduct a geological survey." David looked up, his brown eyes meeting the instructor's primary pair, without flinching. "I understand, Master. I'm just considering my approach." Several nearby students paused in their work, mandibles clicking or tentacles twitching with what David had learned to recognize as alien amusement. The human was clearly out of his depth, probably paralyzed by the sophistication of the task before him. This was what happened when admission standards were lowered for political reasons. "The forges await your use," Tekvar said, gesturing toward the fusion fires that could melt starship hull plating. "Time grows short." David nodded and stood, still holding the flint. Instead of moving toward the forges, however, he walked to a different section of the workshop, the basic tools area, where students could find simple implements for preliminary work. He selected what appeared to be an ordinary piece of iron, roughly the size and shape of a railroad spike, and returned to his station. Now even Master Tekvar was watching with undisguised curiosity. The human set the iron piece on his workbench and raised the flint above his head. Around the hall, the sounds of sophisticated crafting, plasma cutters, gravitic forges, biosynthesis chambers, continued their symphony of creation. Then David brought the stone down. The sharp crack echoed through the hall with surprising clarity, causing several students to look up from their delicate work. Sparks flew as the flint struck iron, but these weren't the brilliant cascades of exotic particles that characterized advanced metallurgy. These were simple, primitive sparks, iron and stone creating friction and heat through pure, basic physics. David struck again and again. With each impact, flakes of stone chipped away, but something interesting was happening to the iron as well. The repeated strikes were flattening it, drawing it out, shaping it through the most fundamental of metalworking techniques, percussion forging. No fusion fire, no gravitational manipulators, no exotic field generators, just stone hitting metal, the way humans had shaped tools since before they had learned to write. "Fascinating," murmured Dr. Ixthan, a visiting professor from the Archaeological Institute who had been observing the class. The crystalline being's faceted form reflected and refracted light in patterns that indicated deep academic interest. "I believe the human is employing what his species calls napping technique in conjunction with rudimentary cold forging." Master Tekvar's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what David had learned indicated confusion mixed with professional curiosity. But the efficiency ratio, the energy expenditure, surely he realizes that fusion forging would produce superior molecular cohesion in a fraction of the time. Around the hall, other students began to take notice. The rhythmic crack, crack, crack of stone on metal created a counterpoint to their more sophisticated efforts. Some found it distracting, others were drawn by the sheer audacity of the approach. A few began to gather at the edges of David's workspace, maintaining respectful distances, but clearly fascinated by what they were witnessing. David continued his work with the focused intensity that his academy instructors had come to recognize as distinctly human. While other species approached problems with either overwhelming computational power, inherited genetic memories, or sophisticated biotechnological integration, humans seemed to possess an almost stubborn determination to persist through pure will and adaptation. The flint was changing as well. Each strike not only shaped the iron, but also gradually modified the stone itself. Chips fell away, but the remaining mass was becoming more refined, more purposeful. David periodically paused to examine both the growing blade and his improvised hammer, making subtle adjustments to his technique based on what the materials themselves were teaching him. "Student Thompson," Master Thekvar approached again, his tone now carrying genuine professional interest rather than barely controlled irritation. "Your technique is unconventional, but I confess I am curious about your ultimate objective." David paused mid-strike, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his free hand. The physical effort of his chosen method was evident. While his classmates worked with technologies that largely eliminated manual labor, he was engaged in the kind of intensive physical craftsmanship that most galactic civilizations had abandoned centuries ago. "Back home," David said, his voice carrying the slight breathlessness of sustained exertion, "my grandfather used to tell me that a tool is only as good as the understanding behind it. You can have the most sophisticated equipment in the universe, but if you don't understand the fundamental principles—" He gestured toward his growing blade, now clearly taking shape under his primitive but determined strikes. "This flint has been shaping metal since before my species had written language. The technique might be simple, but the principles are sound." Cathrax clicked his mandibles in what David had learned was the hive-born equivalent of a thoughtful hum. "But surely efficiency demands—" "Does it?" David interrupted, then immediately looked apologetic. Interrupting a senior student was a significant breach of academy protocol. "I mean, respectfully, does it really? Master Thekvar asked us to forge a blade that speaks to our soul, our heritage. This is mine." He resumed striking, and now the watching students could see that something remarkable was happening. The piece of iron, which had started as a simple, crude spike, was transforming under David's relentless but carefully controlled percussion. It was flattening, yes, but also lengthening, taking on the unmistakable profile of a blade. More impressive still, the repeated impacts were creating a work-hardened edge that, while primitive by galactic standards, was undeniably sharp and functional. But it was the flint that truly captured their attention. What had started as a rough chunk of stone was being shaped by its own impacts against the iron. Each strike not only forged the metal, but also refined the stone, creating a tool that was becoming increasingly sophisticated through use. The human wasn't just making a blade, he was making the hammer to make the blade, improving both implements through the process of their interaction. Velnara, whose own work involved channeling stellar fire through crystalline matrices, found herself drawn to watch despite the pressing demands of her own project. "The recursive refinement," she said, her three-part harmonized voice carrying notes of wonder. "He's using the tool to improve the tool that improves the tool. It's elegantly primitive." "Primitively elegant," corrected Dr. Ixthan, who had moved closer to observe the process in detail. "There's a sophisticated understanding of material properties at work here, but it's being expressed through the most fundamental possible methodology." David had found his rhythm now. The strikes came in steady, measured intervals, each one precisely calculated for maximum effect. He had learned to read the materials, to feel through the impact how the metal was responding, where it wanted to flow, where it needed encouragement. The flint, too, was teaching him, showing him through the way it fractured and reformed, which angles provided the best leverage, which surfaces gave the clearest strikes. Around him, his classmates were reaching various stages of completion in their own projects. Cathrax had grown a blade of living bone that gleamed with its own internal light, bioluminescent bacteria providing both illumination and tactical advantage. Velnara's creation hummed with barely contained plasma, its crystalline edge capable of cutting through ship armor. The granite lords had crafted weapons that looked like they had been carved from the hearts of mountains, dense and powerful enough to shatter lesser materials through pure kinetic force. All of these were undoubtedly superior by any quantifiable measure. They were sharper, stronger, more durable, more versatile. They incorporated technologies that represented millions of years of civilizational advancement, materials that existed nowhere in nature, manufacturing techniques that required mastery of fundamental forces. But there was something about David's approach that commanded attention in a way that pure technical superiority could not. Perhaps it was the visible effort, the physical commitment required by his chosen method. Perhaps it was the recursive elegance that Dr. Ixthan had identified. Or perhaps it was simply the sheer audacious confidence required to attempt such a primitive approach in such an advanced setting. The third sun was approaching the horizon when David finally stepped back from his work. In his right hand, he held a piece of flint that had been refined through use into something resembling a sophisticated knapping tool, its edges precisely shaped for delivering controlled impacts. In his left, he held what was undeniably a blade. It was not beautiful by galactic standards. It lacked the ethereal glow of bioluminescent enhancement, the perfect geometric precision of gravity-forged metals, the shimmer of plasma containment fields. It was, by almost any technological measure, primitive, but it was also unmistakably functional. Master Thekvar approached, his bioluminescent patterns now cycling through what David had learned indicated deep consideration. The instructor extended one of his 4 arms, and David handed over the blade for examination. The Zephyrian's touch was delicate, professional, testing weight and balance with the expertise of someone who had forged weapons for the Imperial Guard. He ran a finger along the edge, carefully, and his patterns shifted to indicate surprise. "The molecular structure," he said, more to himself than to David. "The repeated impact has created a work-hardened edge with remarkable properties. Primitive, yes, but—" He paused, his secondary eyes focusing on details invisible to most of the students. "The flexibility gradient from spine to edge is quite sophisticated. How did you achieve such precise control without temperature management or molecular manipulation?" David smiled, the expression carrying equal parts pride and exhaustion. "Feel. Once you understand how the material wants to behave, you just work with it instead of against it." Around the workshop, other students were presenting their creations to Master Thekvar for evaluation. Each demonstration showcased incredible technical achievement, years of study made manifest in steel and crystal and living bone. The instructor offered appropriate praise and criticism, his patterns indicating professional satisfaction with the general quality of work. But when he returned to David's station, blade still in hand, his demeanor had changed. "Student Thompson," he said, his harmonized voice carrying a note that translated roughly as ceremonial formality. "You were asked to forge a blade that spoke to your soul, your heritage, your understanding of creation." He held up the primitive weapon, its work-hardened surface catching the light of the setting suns. "I believe you may have succeeded more completely than any of your peers." The workshop had grown quiet. Even the most sophisticated projects seemed to pale slightly in comparison to the simple, honest functionality of David's creation. It wasn't superior in any measurable way, but it was undeniably authentic, a true expression of the principles that had guided human development from stone tools to starships. "But Master," Cathrax clicked, his confusion evident in the rapid flutter of his wing cases, "surely the technological sophistication of our other projects demonstrates superior mastery of the required skills." Master Thekvar's patterns shifted to what David had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a thoughtful pause. "Tell me, Cathrax, what did you learn during the forging of your blade?" The hive-born student's mandibles moved in the gesture that indicated consultation with genetic memory. "I learned to better interface with my biosynthesis capabilities, to refine the bacterial cultures that provide luminescence, to improve the calcium-carbon matrix that provides structural integrity." "Excellent," Thekvar acknowledged. "And you, Velnara?" "I learned new harmonies for controlling plasma containment, better understanding of crystalline resonance frequencies, Improved techniques for channeling stellar fire through matrix amplifiers. Also excellent. The instructor turned to David. And what did you learn, Student Thompson? David looked at his hands, still bearing the calluses and minor cuts that were the inevitable result of his chosen method. I learned that iron wants to spread under pressure, but only along certain grain structures. I learned that flint fractures in predictable patterns, but those patterns change as the stone is refined through use. I learned that the rhythm of strikes matters as much as their force, that consistency of application can achieve results that raw power cannot. He paused, considering. But mostly, I learned that the materials themselves are teachers, if you're willing to listen to what they're trying to tell you. The workshop remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Dr. Ixthan spoke, his crystalline form refracting the dying light of the three suns into prismatic patterns across the walls. Fascinating, he said. The human has achieved something that we, in our technological sophistication, may have lost: direct material dialogue, the process of creation as education, where the maker is as changed as the made. Master Thekvar's patterns had shifted to what David was beginning to recognize as deep professional respect. Indeed, Student Thompson, your blade may be primitive by our current standards, but your understanding of the fundamental principles underlying all metallurgy is impressive. Around the workshop, David's classmates were beginning to see his project in a new light. What had initially appeared to be crude desperation was revealing itself as something far more sophisticated, a demonstration of mastery so complete that it could be expressed through the most basic possible means. There is an ancient saying among my people, Master Thekvar continued, his harmonized voice taking on the cadences of formal instruction. The master needs no advanced tools. The advanced tools need no master. You have shown us something valuable today, Student Thompson. As the third sun finally touched the horizon, painting the workshop in shades of amber and gold, David gathered his tools, the refined flint hammer and the forged iron blade. Tomorrow, there would be other challenges, other opportunities to demonstrate that humanity's apparent primitiveness might actually represent something far more sophisticated than his peers initially understood. But for now, he was content to have shown them that sometimes the oldest ways were old for a reason, because they worked. The other students filed out of the workshop, their sophisticated creations humming with contained energies and displaying properties that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. But many of them found their attention drawn back to the simple blade that had been shaped by nothing more than stone and determination, and the quiet human who had reminded them that mastery wasn't always about having the best tools. Sometimes it was about understanding tools so completely that any tool would do. Master Thekvar remained behind as the workshop emptied, studying David's creation under the workbench lights. The blade was indeed primitive by galactic standards, but there was something about its honest functionality, its direct relationship between cause and effect, that spoke to principles he had almost forgotten in millennia of advanced metallurgy. "Student Thompson," he called out as David reached the workshop door. David turned back, wondering if he had somehow violated protocol or caused offense through his unconventional approach. "Your grandfather," Thekvar said, his patterns now showing what David had learned was genuine curiosity. "Was he a smith?" "Blacksmith and toolmaker," David confirmed. "Spent 40 years in the same workshop, making everything from horseshoes to precision instruments. He used to say that a craftsman who truly understood his materials could make anything with anything." "And do you believe that?" David looked back at the workbench where his simple tools still lay, then at the sophisticated fusion forges that his classmates had employed to create their undeniably superior weapons. "Ask me tomorrow," he said with a slight smile. "I think I'm just getting started." As he left the workshop, David could hear Master Thekvar's harmonized laughter echoing off the crystalline walls, a sound that, according to the Academy's cultural guides, indicated something between admiration and anticipation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, David suspected they would provide ample opportunity to test his grandfather's philosophy against the sophisticated technologies of galactic civilization. Behind him, the fusion forges continued their quiet hum, waiting for tomorrow's projects. But on the workbench, a piece of refined flint and a hand-forged blade caught the last light of the setting suns, humble tools that had somehow managed to capture the attention and respect of some of the most sophisticated minds in the galaxy. The next morning brought advanced materials theory with Professor Kexandra, whose crystalline exoskeleton refracted the Academy's artificial lighting into rainbow patterns across the lecture hall. The Silicate Collective representative had been teaching for 3 centuries, her understanding of matter at the quantum level unmatched by any organic species. "Today we examine stress patterns in exotic alloys," she announced, her voice carrying the harmonic resonances that her species used to communicate complex mathematical concepts. "Who can tell me the primary limitation of traditional work-hardening techniques when applied to transuranic metals?" Several appendages shot up immediately. Cathrax's wing cases rattled with enthusiasm, while Velnara's 6 fingers danced through the gestural notation that indicated readiness to respond. David sat quietly in his usual back corner seat, though he noticed more of his classmates glancing his way than usual. Student Kethrax? The hive-born's mandibles clicked as he accessed genetic memories that contained millennia of accumulated knowledge. Traditional work hardening relies on dislocation multiplication within crystal lattice structures. Transuranic metals, with their complex electron shell configurations, exhibit quantum tunneling effects that destabilize conventional lattice formations under mechanical stress. Correct, Professor Kexandra acknowledged, her exoskeleton shifting to patterns that indicated approval. The quantum scale behavior of these materials requires entirely different approaches: plasma forging, gravitic manipulation, field effect stabilization, methods that work around rather than through the traditional stress-strain relationships. She gestured, and holographic displays materialized throughout the lecture hall, showing molecular scale animations of various metals under different types of stress. The complexity was staggering, electrons shifting between quantum states, atomic bonds reforming in response to field effects, entire crystal structures realigning based on forces that operated beyond the scale of traditional physics. "Now," the professor continued, "yesterday's forge work provided an interesting case study. Most of you employed sophisticated techniques appropriate to the materials you selected. However, ... Her faceted eyes turned toward David's section of the hall. "Student Thompson, would you explain your methodology?" David felt the familiar sensation of being suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Around him, his classmates turned to look with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed condescension. Some had clearly expected yesterday's success to be revealed as a fluke under closer academic scrutiny. "I used percussion forging," David said simply. "Strike the metal repeatedly with stone, gradually shaping it through accumulated impact stress." A sound that might charitably be called laughter rippled through the hall. Zilnoth, a student from the Hegemony Core worlds, whose family had been manufacturing starship components for 1,000 years, made no effort to hide his amusement. "Professor," Zilnoth interjected, his translator rendering his harmonic vocalizations with what sounded like barely restrained mirth. "Surely we're not seriously discussing Stone Age techniques as viable metallurgy? The molecular stress patterns alone would create catastrophic failure points throughout the structure." Professor Kexandra's exoskeleton patterns shifted to what David had learned, indicated thoughtful consideration rather than immediate agreement or disagreement. "An interesting assertion, Student Zilnoth. Student Thompson, how do you respond to concerns about molecular stress patterns in your forged blade?" David stood, feeling the weight of attention from some of the most sophisticated minds in the galaxy. Back on Earth, he might have been intimidated by the obvious technological superiority of his peers, but his grandfather's workshop had taught him that understanding trumped equipment, and that confidence came from competence rather than arrogance. With respect, Professor, I think there might be some confusion about what percussion forging actually accomplishes at the molecular level. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Around him, the silence was expectant, some students clearly waiting for him to embarrass himself, others genuinely curious about what the primitive human might have to say. When you strike metal repeatedly with controlled force, you're not creating random stress patterns. You're encouraging the crystal structure to reorganize along lines of maximum strength. Each impact creates micro-deformations that, when accumulated systematically, result in work hardening that's actually more uniform than what you get with rapid heating and cooling methods. Zilnoth's harmonic laughter was less restrained now. Student Thompson, you're describing techniques that my people abandoned before we achieved spaceflight. Surely you realize that modern materials require modern methods? David nodded politely. I'm sure your people's techniques are very impressive. But can you tell me what happens to metal at the atomic level when you work harden it through percussion? The question hung in the air for a moment. Zilnoth's harmonic patterns shifted slightly, indicating consultation with his species' inherited technical knowledge. The repeated stress causes dislocation, multiplication within the crystal lattice, creating areas of increased density that resist further deformation. Right, David agreed. And what determines the specific pattern of dislocation multiplication? Another pause, this one longer. Around the hall, other students were beginning to lean forward, sensing that something interesting was developing. The applied stress vectors and the existing grain structure of the material. Exactly. David's voice carried the patient tone of someone who had learned these concepts through direct experience rather than academic study. So if you control the stress vectors precisely, the angle, force, and frequency of impacts, you can control the dislocation patterns, which means you can control the final strength characteristics of the finished product. Professor Kexandra's exoskeleton was now displaying patterns that David's xenobiology classes had taught him indicated intense professional interest. Continue, Student Thompson. The advantage of percussion forging isn't speed or convenience, David said, warming to his subject. It's feedback. When you use fusion forges or gravitic manipulators, you're applying forces that are so powerful and rapid that you can't feel how the metal is responding. But with percussion forging, every strike tells you something about the current state of the material. You can adjust in real time based on what the metal itself is telling you. He gestured toward the holographic displays that still showed molecular scale stress patterns. Those models are very sophisticated, but they're based on theoretical predictions about how materials should behave. Percussion forging is based on how materials actually do behave, moment by moment, under specific conditions. The lecture hall had grown very quiet. Even Zilnoth seemed to be reconsidering his initial dismissal, his harmonic patterns shifting to what David was beginning to recognize as thoughtful uncertainty. Furthermore, David continued, gaining confidence as he spoke, the technique scales. You can use the same basic principles whether you're working with simple iron or exotic alloys. The materials might behave differently, but the fundamental approach, controlled stress application with continuous feedback monitoring, remains valid. Professor Kexandra moved closer to David's section of the hall, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated she was processing complex calculations. Student Thompson, are you suggesting that percussion forging techniques could be applied to transuranic metals? I'm suggesting that the principles underlying percussion forging, precise stress control, real-time feedback, gradual modification based on material response, might be more universally applicable than current methods assume. The professor's exoskeleton shifted to patterns that David couldn't interpret, but which caused a stir of recognition among students from species that had longer contact with the silicate collective. She was, according to David's cultural guides, displaying what her people considered deep academic excitement. "Fascinating," she said, her harmonic voice taking on overtones that suggested she was already developing experimental protocols. "The quantum tunneling effects that make transuranic metals difficult to work with conventional high-energy techniques might actually be less disruptive under low-energy, high-precision conditions." Around the hall, students were beginning to exchange glances that contained significantly more respect and considerably less condescension than they had 5 minutes earlier. The primitive human might actually be onto something that their sophisticated civilizations had overlooked. However, Professor Kex Alexandra continued, theory and practice often diverge. Student Thompson, would you be willing to demonstrate your techniques on more challenging materials? David felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. This was the moment when confident theory met potentially embarrassing reality. But his grandfather had taught him that the best way to learn was to attempt things that might not work, and the worst that could happen was failure, which was itself a form of education. "I'd be honored to try, Professor." The rest of the lecture period was spent designing an experimental protocol. Professor Kexandra produced samples of materials that represented various levels of complexity beyond simple iron, titanium alloys, ceramic composites, and finally a small piece of what she called stabilized plutonium matrix, a transuranic metal that required specialized containment fields just to handle safely. "We'll start with the titanium," she decided, her patterns indicating what David hoped was confidence in his survival prospects. If Student Thompson's techniques prove effective with conventional advanced materials, we can consider more exotic applications. The class period ended with the unusual situation of students actually volunteering to remain after hours to observe the experimental session. Even Zilnoth, who had been so dismissive earlier, lingered near the laboratory entrance with expressions that David's xenobiology training suggested indicated grudging curiosity mixed with skeptical anticipation. That evening, the Academy's materials laboratory became an unlikely gathering place for some of the most sophisticated minds in the galaxy. Professor Kexandra had prepared a titanium alloy sample, a rectangular bar roughly the size of David's forearm, composed of materials that were routinely used in starship construction. "The challenge," she explained to the assembled students, "is that titanium alloys work harden very rapidly under mechanical stress. Traditional percussion techniques typically result in material failure long before significant strengthening occurs." David examined the sample, feeling its weight, running his fingers along its edges to assess grain structure and potential stress points. The material was definitely more challenging than the simple iron he had worked with yesterday, denser, harder, less forgiving of imprecise technique. "The key," he said, more to himself than to his audience, "is probably frequency rather than force. Titanium work hardens quickly, so you need to stay ahead of the hardening curve." He selected his tools carefully. The refined flint from yesterday's work was still serviceable, but he also chose a steel striker that would provide different impact characteristics. The two-hammer approach would give him more control over the specific types of stress he applied. "Student Thompson," Professor Kexandra said, her harmonic voice carrying notes of what David hoped was professional concern rather than anticipation of spectacular failure, "please remember that titanium alloys can exhibit explosive fracture characteristics under certain stress conditions." David nodded, positioning safety barriers and adjusting the laboratory's protective fields. Around him, his classmates took positions that balanced optimal viewing angles with reasonable survival distances. Then, he began to work. The first few strikes were gentle, almost tentative, as David felt for the material's response characteristics. Titanium was definitely different from iron. It transmitted impact energy differently, had different resonant frequencies, wanted to flow along different patterns, but the fundamental principles still applied: controlled stress application, continuous feedback, gradual modification based on material response. As he found his rhythm, David began to understand what the titanium was trying to teach him. It work-hardened quickly, yes, but it also had a kind of memory. Previous stresses influenced how it responded to subsequent ones. By varying the angle and intensity of his strikes, he could encourage the material to develop strength characteristics that were more sophisticated than simple uniform hardening. "Remarkable," Professor Kexandra murmured, her exoskeleton displaying patterns that indicated real-time analysis of the stress patterns David was creating. The molecular modifications are forming in layered gradients rather than uniform distributions. I've never seen work-hardening patterns quite like these. Around the laboratory, students who had initially come to observe a curiosity were now watching genuine innovation unfold. David's primitive techniques were producing results that their sophisticated understanding of materials science suggested should not be possible. Cathrax clicked his mandibles in what David had learned was the hive-born equivalent of respectful amazement. The stress distribution patterns are actually more sophisticated than what our biosynthesis techniques achieve. How is this possible with such basic tools? David paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. The physical demands of precision percussion forging were considerable, but the titanium was responding beautifully to his efforts. "I think," he said, breathing hard from the sustained effort, "it might be because the tools are basic. When you use advanced techniques, you're imposing your will on the material. When you use basic techniques, you're having a conversation with it." Velnara's harmonized voice carried notes of what David was learning to recognize as philosophical consideration. A conversation. Every strike tells me something about how the material is changing, and I adjust the next strike based on that information. It's feedback at the speed of experience rather than the speed of computation. He resumed work, and now his audience could see what he meant. David's strikes weren't following any predetermined pattern. Instead, they were constantly adapting based on subtle cues that he was reading from the material itself. The sound of each impact, the feel of the rebound, the visual changes in the metal surface, all of these were providing information that guided his next decision. "It's like he's reading the material's mind," whispered one student. "More like the material is teaching him," corrected another. Professor Kexandra's analytical equipment was providing real-time molecular-scale imaging of David's work, and what the displays showed was unprecedented. The titanium alloy was developing strength characteristics that combined the best aspects of multiple conventional techniques. Work hardening was occurring in precise gradients rather than uniform layers. Stress patterns were forming that would provide maximum strength with minimum brittleness. "Student Thompson," she said, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of academic excitement that made several students look up in surprise, "I believe you may be pioneering an entirely new field of materials science." David continued his methodical work, unaware that his demonstration was being recorded for later analysis by some of the galaxy's foremost metallurgical experts. He was simply doing what his grandfather had taught him, listening to the materials and responding to what they told him. When he finally stepped back, the titanium sample had been transformed. What had started as a simple rectangular bar was now clearly recognizable as a blade, not as sophisticated in appearance as yesterday's projects, but unmistakably functional and, according to Professor Kexandra's instruments, possessed of strength characteristics that exceeded theoretical predictions for the base material. "Impossible," Zilnoth said, though his harmonic pattern suggested wonder rather than disbelief. The molecular stress patterns should have created catastrophic failure points throughout the structure. Instead, ... Instead, Professor Kexandra finished, "we have what appears to be the most efficiently work-hardened titanium alloy sample I have ever analyzed." The laboratory fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled students. David wiped his hands on a cloth, seemingly unaware that he had just challenged several millennia of accepted metallurgical doctrine. Around him, some of the most sophisticated minds in the galaxy were rapidly recalculating their understanding of fundamental materials science. "Professor," Cuthrax said, his wing cases fluttering with what David had learned indicated deep uncertainty, "if these techniques are so effective, why haven't our civilizations discovered them?" Professor Kexandra's crystalline form refracted the laboratory lights as she considered the question. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "because we've been so focused on transcending basic physical limitations that we've overlooked ways to work more effectively within them." She gestured toward the monitoring displays that still showed molecular scale analyses of David's work. "Our advanced techniques allow us to impose specific characteristics on materials through the application of overwhelming force, fusion temperatures, gravitational manipulation, quantum field effects. We shape matter by overpowering its natural tendencies." The professor paused, her harmonic voice taking on the cadences of someone developing a new theoretical framework in real time. "But Student Thompson's approach works with the material's natural tendencies, encouraging it to develop strength characteristics through processes it's already inclined toward. Instead of forcing the outcome, he's negotiating it." Velnara's six-fingered hands moved through gestural patterns that indicated she was processing complex philosophical implications. "It's almost like the difference between conquest and diplomacy. Both can achieve similar objectives, but through fundamentally different methodologies." David had been listening to this analysis with growing amazement. Back home, his grandfather's techniques had been respected but hardly revolutionary. Traditional craftsmanship that was valued more for its cultural significance than its practical applications. Here, surrounded by technologies that could manipulate matter at the quantum level, those same techniques were being discussed as potentially paradigm-shifting innovations. "The question now," Professor Kexandra continued, "is whether these principles can be applied to truly exotic materials. Student Thompson, would you be willing to attempt your techniques on the stabilized plutonium matrix?" Around the laboratory, the assembled students suddenly looked significantly more nervous. Stabilized plutonium matrix was not forgiving of experimental techniques. Failure modes typically involved energetic releases that could sterilize several cubic kilometers of surrounding space. David examined the sample that Professor Kexandra produced from its containment field, a piece roughly the size of his thumb, glowing with a faint internal luminescence that indicated barely contained nuclear forces. Even through the protective fields, he could feel the material's aggressive instability, its eagerness to return to more chaotic atomic arrangements. "This is different," he admitted, studying the sample with the careful attention he had learned was essential when working with unfamiliar materials. "The grain structure is constantly shifting, and there's some kind of field effect that resists external manipulation." "Precisely," the professor confirmed. "Transuranic metals exist in quantum states that make them extremely resistant to conventional metallurgy. The quantum tunneling effects that student Zilnoth mentioned earlier essentially mean that the material exists partially outside our normal space-time framework." David nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure he fully understood the quantum mechanics involved. What he could understand, however, was how the material felt under his examination: restless, unstable, but not chaotic. There were patterns in its behavior, rhythms that suggested it might be possible to work with rather than against its exotic properties. "I think," he said carefully, "the key might be frequency matching. Instead of trying to impose a rhythm on the material, maybe I need to find its natural rhythm and work within it." He selected his tools even more carefully this time, choosing the refined flint from yesterday's work rather than the steel striker he had used on the titanium. Something about the plutonium matrix suggested it would respond better to stone than to more advanced materials, perhaps because stone itself was quantum stable in ways that processed metals were not. "Student Thompson," Professor Kexandra said, her harmonic voice carrying unmistakable notes of concern, "please remember that if the quantum containment fields collapse, we will have approximately 3 seconds to evacuate to minimum safe distance before the material undergoes explosive decoherence." David positioned himself at the specially reinforced workstation that the laboratory used for high-energy experiments. Around him, his classmates took positions behind multiple layers of protective barriers, though several had to be encouraged to maintain safe distances by Professor Kexandra's increasingly insistent harmonic warnings. The first strike was barely a tap, more of a test than an attempt at actual forging. David needed to understand how the exotic material would respond before he could develop an effective approach. The result was immediately obvious to everyone in the laboratory. Instead of the sharp crack of stone on metal that had characterized his earlier work, this impact produced a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through dimensions that normal materials didn't access. The laboratory's quantum monitoring equipment registered fluctuations that indicated the plutonium matrix was actually stabilizing under the controlled stress. "Fascinating," Professor Kexandra breathed, her exoskeleton displaying patterns that David was beginning to recognize as scientific euphoria. "The percussion is providing quantum anchoring. The material is using the kinetic input to stabilize its position in normal spacetime." David continued his careful work, each strike precisely calculated to reinforce the stabilization effects rather than overwhelm them. This was definitely the most challenging material he had ever attempted to forge. It required absolute precision, perfect timing, and constant adjustment based on quantum feedback that he was learning to interpret through subtle changes in sound, feel, and even the way the air tasted around the workstation. Around the laboratory, his audience watched in fascination as the impossible unfolded before them. The stabilized plutonium matrix, which should have been essentially unworkable through mechanical techniques, was gradually taking shape under David's patient percussion. More remarkably, it was becoming more stable rather than less so. The quantum containment fields were actually strengthening as the material was worked. "This shouldn't be possible," Zilnov said, though his harmonic patterns now indicated wonder rather than skepticism. "Our theoretical models predict that mechanical stress should destabilize transuranic quantum matrices." "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Ixthan, who had arrived partway through the demonstration and was now recording everything for later analysis, "the theoretical models are based on high-energy mechanical stress. Student Thompson's techniques apply mechanical stress gradually, allowing the quantum systems to adapt rather than forcing rapid state changes." David was too focused on his work to participate in the theoretical discussion, but he could feel that Dr. Ixthan was onto something important. The plutonium matrix was teaching him that exotic materials required exotic approaches, not necessarily more advanced approaches, but approaches that respected their unique properties rather than trying to force them into familiar patterns. Each strike was now a complex negotiation between David's intentions and the material's quantum-level preferences. Too much force, and the containment fields would destabilize. Too little, and the material wouldn't respond at all. But within a very narrow range of intensity and frequency, the plutonium matrix was proving remarkably cooperative, almost as if it wanted to be shaped once it understood that the shaping process wouldn't threaten its exotic stability. "Student Thompson," Professor Kexandra said, her voice carrying notes that David couldn't interpret, but which caused his classmates to look up with expressions of surprise. "I believe you have just demonstrated something that our civilization has been attempting to achieve for over 2,000 years." David paused in his work, looking up to see the professor's exoskeleton displaying patterns that his xenobiology training told him indicated the silicate collective equivalent of profound respect. You have successfully work-hardened a transuranic metal using mechanical techniques. According to our most advanced theoretical models, what you have just accomplished should be physically impossible. Around the laboratory, the assembled students were staring at David with expressions that contained no trace of the condescension they had shown just hours earlier. The primitive human had not only challenged their assumptions, he had proven them wrong through simple, direct demonstration. "The implications are staggering," Dr. Ixton said, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated rapid data processing. "If these techniques can be systematized, scaled up, integrated with our existing manufacturing capabilities, we could revolutionize materials science across the galaxy," Professor Kexandra finished. "Student Thompson, I believe you may have inadvertently launched a new technological age." David looked down at the piece of stabilized plutonium matrix that had been transformed under his primitive stone hammer. It was unmistakably a blade now, not as elegant as the sophisticated weapons his classmates had created, but possessed of strength characteristics that exceeded anything their advanced technologies could produce. "My grandfather always said that the best tools are the ones that help you understand the work," David said, setting down his flint hammer and stretching muscles that ached from the sustained precision effort. "I think maybe that's what happened here. Instead of trying to force the material to do what I wanted, I tried to understand what it wanted to do and then helped it do that more effectively." The laboratory remained quiet for a moment as the assembled minds processed the philosophical implications of David's statement. In a galaxy where technological advancement was typically measured by the ability to overcome natural limitations, the human had achieved breakthrough results by working within them. "Student Thompson," Professor Kexandra said finally, her harmonic voice carrying formal overtones that David's cultural training told him indicated ceremonial significance, "I believe it would be appropriate for you to present your techniques to the Academy's Board of Advanced Studies. This level of innovation merits institutional attention." Around the laboratory, David's classmates nodded agreement, some enthusiastically, others with the grudging respect of individuals whose fundamental assumptions had been challenged and found wanting. The primitive human had done more than succeed at an assigned task. He had opened new avenues of investigation that could occupy their civilizations for generations. As the evening's demonstration concluded and students began to file out of the laboratory, many stopped to examine David's work more closely. The 3 blades he had created, simple iron, titanium alloy, and stabilized plutonium matrix, represented a progression of complexity that challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between technological sophistication and practical effectiveness. Kethrax lingered longer than most, his mandibles clicking as he studied the plutonium matrix blade with the careful attention of someone whose genetic memories contained millennia of metallurgical knowledge. "Student Thompson," he said finally, "my people have been working with exotic materials since before most species achieved spaceflight. We have techniques that can reshape matter at the quantum level, technologies that can impose our will on the fundamental forces of nature." David nodded politely, unsure where the conversation was heading. "But in all that time, with all those capabilities, we have never achieved results like these. Your techniques are primitive, yes, but they are also—" Kethrax paused, his wing cases fluttering as he searched for appropriate terminology. "They are more honest. They work with reality instead of trying to overwhelm it." As the laboratory finally emptied except for Professor Kexandra and her monitoring equipment, David gathered his simple tools, the refined flint, the basic iron striker, the understanding that his grandfather had passed down through generations of craftsmen who had learned to listen to their materials rather than simply commanding them. "Student Thompson," the professor said, her crystalline form still displaying patterns of scientific excitement, "I suspect tomorrow will bring considerable attention from individuals who wish to understand your techniques. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" David looked at the 3 blades he had created, each one a demonstration that sophisticated results didn't always require sophisticated methods. Sometimes they just required sophisticated understanding applied through simple, direct action. "Professor," he said with a slight smile, "my grandfather used to say that if you're doing good work, people will eventually notice." I think maybe he was right. The morning brought more attention than David had anticipated. Word of the previous evening's demonstration had spread through the Academy's communication networks with the speed that only truly surprising news could achieve. By the time he arrived for his first class, Comparative Xenobiology with Dr. Velthresh, David found himself surrounded by students, faculty members, and visiting researchers who wanted to discuss his techniques. "Student Thompson," called out Master Engineer Corinth, whose massive form dominated the corridor with the casual authority of someone who had designed the propulsion systems for half the fleet ships in the Outer Rim. "I understand you've been conducting materials research with unconventional methodologies." David nodded politely, though he was still adjusting to being the center of this level of attention. Yesterday, most of these individuals had barely acknowledged his existence. Today, he seemed to be the subject of intense curiosity from some of the most accomplished minds in the galaxy. "I've been using some traditional techniques from my homeworld," he said carefully. "Professor Kexandra thought they might have broader applications." Master Engineer Corinth's harmonic laughter resonated through the corridor with the deep bass tones that indicated genuine amusement rather than mockery. "Traditional techniques that apparently achieve results our most advanced manufacturing systems cannot duplicate. Young human, I believe you may have understated the significance of your discoveries." Around them, other faculty members were nodding agreement. David found himself the unexpected center of a growing crowd that included representatives from several of the Academy's most prestigious research departments. "The question," said Dr. Nethkin from Advanced Theoretical Physics, her tentacle-like appendages weaving through gestural patterns that indicated complex mathematical calculations, "is whether your techniques represent isolated anomalies or systematic principles that could be generalized across multiple applications." Before David could respond, Professor Kexandra arrived, her crystalline form displaying patterns that David was learning to recognize as polite but firm authority. "Colleagues," she said, her harmonic voice cutting through the general discussion with academic precision, "while I appreciate your interest in Student Thompson's work, perhaps we should allow him to attend his scheduled classes before we subject him to intensive research protocols." The crowd dispersed with the reluctant efficiency of academics who recognized legitimate authority, though many lingered long enough to express their interest in future discussions. David found himself both grateful for Professor Kexandra's intervention and slightly overwhelmed by the implications of the attention he was receiving. "Student Thompson," the professor said once they were alone, "I should perhaps warn you that your techniques have attracted notice beyond the Academy. The materials research divisions of several major industrial corporations have submitted requests for detailed analyses of your methodologies." David paused in the corridor, processing the information. Back home, his grandfather's workshop had served the local community, farmers who needed tools repaired, craftsmen who required specialized implements, the occasional artist who wanted something unique created. The idea that his simple techniques might have galactic commercial applications was both exciting and vaguely intimidating. "What kind of applications?" he asked. "Starship hull construction, for one. The work-hardening patterns you achieved with the titanium alloy would provide superior asteroid impact resistance compared to current manufacturing techniques. Weapons manufacturing is another obvious application. Your plutonium matrix blade demonstrates strength characteristics that exceed military specifications by significant margins." Professor Kexandra's exoskeleton shifted to patterns that David had learned indicated careful consideration of complex factors. "There are also potential applications in infrastructure development, precision instrument manufacturing, and exotic materials processing that could affect everything from communications technology to interstellar transportation systems. David found himself thinking about his grandfather again, remembering countless hours in the workshop, learning that every piece of metal had its own personality, its own preferences for how it wanted to be shaped. The old man had never imagined that his techniques might someday influence the development of technologies he could barely comprehend. "Professor," David said slowly, "my grandfather always taught me that good craftsmanship was about understanding the materials and respecting what they could become. Do you think that principle scales up to all of this?" The professor's crystalline form refracted the corridor's lighting as she considered the question. "Student Thompson, I believe your grandfather may have taught you something that our advanced civilizations have forgotten, that the most sophisticated technologies are often those that work with natural principles rather than against them." She gestured toward the Academy's central tower, where the Board of Advanced Studies maintained offices that influenced technological development across dozens of star systems. "This afternoon, you'll have an opportunity to present your techniques to individuals who can determine whether your principles do indeed scale up to galactic applications." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes where David found himself the subject of intense but respectful attention. In comparative xenobiology, Dr. Velthresh spent considerable time discussing how different species' physiological capabilities might influence their approach to materials science, with specific reference to how human sensory feedback systems might provide advantages in precision craftsmanship that other species' more sophisticated perceptual mechanisms could not match. Advanced diplomatic protocol included a discussion of how technological innovations often required careful cultural integration to be successfully adopted across multiple civilizations. Professor Thaincris, whose species had been mediating intergalactic disputes for over a millennium, noted that David's techniques represented exactly the kind of innovation that could either facilitate greater cooperation or create new sources of competitive tension, depending on how they were introduced and managed. Even theoretical hypermathematics, which David normally found challenging due to the course's reliance on mathematical concepts that humans hadn't yet independently developed, included references to his work. Dr. Krinthax demonstrated how the stress distribution patterns in David's blades could be described using mathematical models that revealed previously unknown relationships between force application and molecular reorganization. By the time afternoon arrived, David felt simultaneously honored by the attention and overwhelmed by the implications. His simple desire to complete a class assignment had apparently triggered academic discussions that could influence technological development across the galaxy. The Academy's Board of Advanced Studies met in a crystalline amphitheater that could accommodate representatives from dozens of different species simultaneously. As David entered the chamber, he was struck by the diversity of forms that surrounded him, some familiar from his classes, others representing civilizations he had only read about in xenobiological surveys. At the center of the amphitheater sat Chancellor Vexandra, whose ancient form suggested she had been present when the Academy was first established centuries ago. Her species, the Eternal Observers, were rumored to experience time differently than most organic beings, giving them perspectives on technological development that spanned geological ages. "Student Thompson," the Chancellor said, her voice carrying harmonics that David's translator rendered as formal but not unfriendly. "We understand. You have developed techniques that challenge some fundamental assumptions about material science. We would be honored to observe a demonstration." David nodded, though he noticed that his hands were shaking slightly as he set up his simple tools at the demonstration station that had been prepared for him. Around the amphitheater, some of the most influential minds in galactic civilization were waiting to see whether his techniques represented genuine innovation or merely interesting anomalies. "Today," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt, "I'd like to show you something my grandfather taught me about understanding materials." The amphitheater fell silent as David selected his sample, a piece of what the Academy's materials catalog listed as crystallized neutronium composite, a material so exotic that it existed only under laboratory conditions and required constant energy input to maintain structural stability. It was, by any reasonable measure, impossible to work with conventional metallurgical techniques. The challenge with exotic materials, David continued, examining the sample with the careful attention he had learned was essential when working with unfamiliar substances, is that we often assume they require exotic techniques, but sometimes the most exotic thing you can do is apply basic principles in a completely straightforward way. Around the amphitheater, representatives from dozens of civilizations leaned forward with expressions of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, barely concealed anticipation of spectacular failure. Crystallized neutronium composite was not forgiving of experimental approaches. Mistakes typically resulted in localized space-time distortions that could take decades to stabilize. David selected his tools with extra care. For this demonstration, he had chosen to work with a piece of obsidian that he had personally knapped to precise specifications, along with a fragment of meteoric iron that had been work-hardened through traditional techniques. Both materials were, by galactic standards, absurdly primitive, but they were also quantum stable in ways that more sophisticated alternatives were not. The key, he said, positioning the neutronium composite sample at the specially reinforced workstation, is recognizing that exotic materials are still materials. They may have unusual properties, but they still follow physical laws. The question is whether you can find the right way to work within those laws rather than trying to overwhelm them. Chancellor Vexandra's ancient form shifted slightly, her harmonic voice carrying overtones that David's cultural training told him indicated deep interest. Student Thompson, please proceed with caution. Crystallized neutronium composite has exhibited unpredictable responses to mechanical stress in previous experiments. David nodded, though he had already begun to feel for the material's natural rhythms through gentle test taps with his obsidian striker. The neutronium composite was definitely the most challenging substance he had ever attempted to work with. It existed partially outside normal spacetime, required constant energy input to maintain coherence, and exhibited quantum properties that made it essentially impossible to predict how it would respond to any given stimulus. But it was also, fundamentally, matter, and matter, regardless of how exotic its properties might be, still followed principles that could be understood through careful observation and patient experimentation. The first actual strike was barely a whisper of contact, more of a test than an attempt at actual forging. The result was immediately apparent to everyone in the amphitheater. Instead of the sharp crack or harmonic resonance that had characterized his earlier work, this impact produced a sound that seemed to exist in dimensions that normal acoustics couldn't access. The Academy's monitoring equipment registered fluctuations that indicated the neutronium composite was actually stabilizing under the controlled stress, its exotic quantum properties finding new equilibrium states that required less external energy to maintain. "Remarkable," whispered Dr. Thekrin from the Advanced Materials Institute, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated rapid analysis of unprecedented data. The mechanical stress is providing quantum anchoring that's more efficient than our electromagnetic stabilization fields. David continued his careful work, each strike precisely calculated based on feedback that he was learning to interpret through subtle changes in the material's behavior. The neutronium composite was teaching him that truly exotic materials required not just precision and patience, but a willingness to completely abandon preconceived notions about how matter should behave under stress. Around the amphitheater, his audience watched in fascination as the impossible unfolded before them. The crystallized neutronium composite, which should have been essentially unworkable through mechanical techniques, was gradually taking shape under David's patient percussion. More remarkably, it was becoming more stable rather than less so, The exotic quantum fields that maintained its coherence were actually strengthening as the material was worked. "This is unprecedented," said Fleet Admiral Corex, whose species had been developing advanced materials for starship construction for over 5 millennia. "Our theoretical models predict that mechanical stress should destabilize neutronium matrices at the quantum level. Instead, we're observing increased coherence and structural integrity." "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Velshan from theoretical physics, "the mechanical stress is providing resonance patterns that align with the material's natural quantum frequencies rather than fighting against them." David was too focused on his work to participate in the theoretical discussion, but he could feel that Dr. Velshan was onto something important. The neutronium composite was teaching him that the most exotic materials might actually require the most basic approaches, not because they were simple, but because they were so complex that only fundamental principles could navigate their intricacies successfully. Each strike was now a delicate negotiation between David's intentions and the material's exotic properties. Too much force, and the quantum stabilization fields would collapse. Too little, and the material wouldn't respond at all. But within a very narrow range of intensity, frequency, and timing, the neutronium composite was proving remarkably cooperative, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to understand its preferred methods of interaction. "Student Thompson," Chancellor Vexandra said, her ancient voice carrying harmonics that caused several representatives to look up with expressions of surprise, "I believe you are demonstrating something that our combined civilizations have been attempting to achieve for over 3,000 years. David paused in his work, looking up to see the Chancellor's form displaying patterns that his xenobiological training told him indicated the eternal observer equivalent of profound respect. "You are successfully work-hardening a neutronium composite using purely mechanical techniques. According to our most advanced theoretical models, what you are accomplishing should require technologies that we have not yet developed." Around the amphitheater, representatives from dozens of civilizations were staring at David with expressions that contained no trace of the polite skepticism they had shown at the beginning of his demonstration. The primitive human had not only challenged their fundamental assumptions about material science, he was proving them wrong through simple, direct demonstration using tools that their ancestors had abandoned millennia ago. "The implications extend far beyond material science," said Commerce Director Netherix, whose cybernetic augmentations interfaced directly with galactic economic networks. "If these techniques can be systematized and scaled for industrial applications, we could be looking at the most significant technological advancement in recorded history. Infrastructure development, starship construction, precision manufacturing, virtually every industry that depends on advanced materials could be revolutionized," added Chief Engineer Vorthen from the Stellar Development Authority. David looked down at the piece of crystallized neutronium composite that was taking shape under his primitive obsidian hammer. It was becoming recognizably blade-like, but more importantly, it was becoming stable. The exotic quantum properties that had required constant energy input were now self-sustaining, locked into patterns that his mechanical techniques had encouraged rather than forced. "My grandfather always said that the material knows what it wants to become," David said, setting down his tools and stretching muscles that ached from the sustained precision effort. "The craftsman's job isn't to force it into a shape, but to help it find the shape it's trying to achieve." The amphitheater remained quiet for a moment, as representatives from some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy processed the philosophical implications of David's statement. In cultures where technological advancement was typically measured by the ability to impose will upon reality, the human had achieved breakthrough results by working in partnership with the fundamental properties of matter. "Student Thompson," Chancellor Vexandra said finally, her harmonic voice carrying formal overtones that David's cultural training told him indicated ceremonial significance. The Board of Advanced Studies hereby recognizes your techniques as representing a new paradigm in materials science. We recommend immediate establishment of a research institute dedicated to exploring the broader applications of your methodologies. Around the amphitheater, representatives nodded agreement, some enthusiastically, others with the careful consideration of individuals whose fundamental worldviews had been challenged and found incomplete. The primitive human had done more than demonstrate innovative techniques. He had opened new avenues of investigation that could occupy their civilizations for centuries. Furthermore, the Chancellor continued, we recommend that student Thompson be granted advanced research status and provided with whatever resources he requires to continue developing these techniques. The potential applications extend far beyond materials science into areas that could affect every aspect of galactic civilization. As the formal session concluded and representatives began to file out of the amphitheater, many stopped to examine David's work more closely. The blade he had created from crystallized neutronium composite represented a level of materials engineering that their most advanced technologies could not duplicate, achieved using tools that their ancestors would have recognized. Fleet Admiral Corex lingered longer than most, studying the neutronium blade with the careful attention of someone whose decisions could affect the security of entire star systems. Student Thompson, he said finally, my people have been developing advanced materials for starship construction since before most species achieved interstellar capability. We have technologies that can manipulate matter at the quantum level, manufacturing systems that can impose precise molecular structures on exotic materials. David nodded politely, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. But in all that time, with all those capabilities, we have never achieved results like this. Your techniques are primitive, yes, but they are also more effective than anything we have developed. The Admiral paused, his expression thoughtful. They suggest that we may have been approaching materials science from entirely the wrong direction. As the amphitheater finally emptied except for Academy faculty and monitoring equipment, David gathered his simple tools, the napped obsidian, the meteoric iron, the understanding that his grandfather had passed down through generations of craftsmen who had learned to work with materials rather than against them. Student Thompson, Professor Kexandra said, her crystalline form still displaying patterns of scientific excitement, I suspect the next few months will bring opportunities that will change not only your life, but potentially the technological development of our entire galactic community. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? David looked at the 3 blades he had created over the past few days, simple iron, titanium alloy, and crystallized neutronium composite. Each one represented a progression, not just in material complexity, but in understanding how the most sophisticated results could be achieved through the most fundamental approaches. Professor, he said with a slight smile, my grandfather used to say that if you do good work with honest intentions, the results will take care of themselves. I think maybe it's time to find out if he was right. The weeks that followed brought changes that David could never have anticipated. The Academy established the Thompson Institute for Applied Materials Science, with David as its first director, despite his status as a student. Research teams from across the galaxy arrived to study his techniques, bringing with them materials so exotic that some existed only in theoretical models. But perhaps the most significant change was in how his fellow students treated him. The casual dismissal that had characterized their early interactions had been replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Even Zil Noth, who had been most vocal in his initial skepticism, had requested permission to study under David's guidance. The thing is, Cuthrax said one afternoon as they worked together in the Institute's main laboratory, your techniques aren't really primitive at all. They're sophisticated in ways that our advanced technologies can't match. David paused in his examination of a sample of what the research catalog listed as temporally stabilized dark matter, material that existed partially outside normal time flow and required careful handling to prevent causality paradoxes. How do you mean? Cathrax's mandibles clicked as he formulated his response. Our technologies are sophisticated in their components. They use advanced principles, exotic materials, complex systems. But your techniques are sophisticated in their understanding. They work with reality instead of trying to remake it. Around the laboratory, other students nodded agreement. The past few weeks had brought a steady stream of revelations as David's principles were applied to increasingly challenging materials. Each success had reinforced the growing understanding that the most advanced technologies might actually be those that worked most effectively within natural laws rather than attempting to transcend them. It's like the difference between forcing a door and finding the right key, Velnara added, her harmonized voice carrying notes of philosophical consideration. Both approaches can open the door, but one requires constant application of force, while the other requires only understanding. David continued his careful examination of the dark matter sample, feeling for the subtle rhythms that would indicate how the exotic material preferred to be shaped. Working with temporally displaced matter required not just precision, but also an intuitive understanding of how forces applied in the present could influence structures that existed partially in the future. I think, he said slowly, maybe that's what my grandfather was really teaching me. Not specific techniques, but a way of approaching problems that starts with understanding rather than force. The dark matter sample was responding to his gentle test strikes in ways that the monitoring equipment could barely register. Unlike normal matter, which exhibited predictable stress-strain relationships, temporally stabilized dark matter seemed to respond to intention as much as force, as if the material could sense what David was trying to achieve and was choosing whether or not to cooperate. Remarkable, whispered Dr. Chenvala, the Institute's newly appointed theoretical physicist. The temporal displacement patterns are actually stabilizing under mechanical stress. We've been assuming that dark matter required exotic field manipulation, but it appears to respond better to direct physical interaction. Around the laboratory, research teams from a dozen different civilizations watched in fascination as David gradually shaped the dark matter sample into something resembling a blade. The process was unlike anything they had previously observed. Matter that existed partially outside normal spacetime was being influenced by tools and techniques that their ancestors would have recognized. "Student Thompson," said Master Thekvar, who had arrived to observe the latest demonstration, "I believe you have achieved something unprecedented. You have successfully forged a blade from material that technically does not entirely exist in our reality." David stepped back from his work, examining the dark matter blade that seemed to shift slightly even when he wasn't looking directly at it. The material's temporal displacement gave it properties that were almost magical. It was simultaneously incredibly sharp and completely harmless, capable of cutting through virtually any substance while being unable to cause unintended harm. "It's not really that I forged it," David said, setting down his tools with the careful precision that had become habitual when working with exotic materials. "It's more like I helped it find the shape it was trying to become. The material did most of the work." The statement might have sounded modest, but everyone in the laboratory understood its deeper implications. David hadn't imposed his will on the dark matter. He had entered into partnership with it, learning its preferences and working to fulfill them in ways that served both his intentions and the material's natural tendencies. "This changes everything," Dr. Chenvala said, her multiple appendages weaving through gestural patterns that indicated complex theoretical calculations. "If mechanical techniques can influence temporally displaced matter, then we may need to completely reconsider our understanding of the relationship between physical forces and exotic materials." Over the following months, David's techniques were applied to increasingly challenging materials with increasingly impressive results. Quantum foam was stabilized into functional structures. Exotic particles that normally existed for nanoseconds were convinced to maintain coherence long enough to be incorporated into permanent constructions. Materials that existed only in theoretical models were successfully created and shaped using nothing more sophisticated than stone and iron tools guided by patient understanding. Each success brought new attention from civilizations across the galaxy. Trade delegations arrived seeking to license the techniques for commercial applications. Military representatives wanted to discuss weapons development. Researchers proposed joint expeditions to gather materials from the cores of neutron stars and the event horizons of black holes. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his fellow students, who had transformed from skeptical observers into eager collaborators. The Academy's workshop, once divided by species and technological traditions, had become a place where diverse approaches to problems were valued and integrated. "You know what I think happened?" Velnara said one evening as they worked together on a project that combined David's percussion techniques with her species' harmonic manipulation methods. "I think you reminded us that technology isn't about having the most advanced tools. It's about understanding the work deeply enough to choose the right approach." David looked around the workshop where students from dozens of different civilizations were experimenting with combinations of ancient techniques and cutting-edge technologies. Cathrax was using biosynthesis in conjunction with percussion forging to create weapons that grew stronger under stress. The Granite Lords had adapted their seismic hammering to work with crystalline matrices that Velnara had designed to resonate with stellar frequencies. Even Zilnoth had begun incorporating feedback-based techniques into his family's traditional manufacturing processes. "I think maybe," David said, returning to his own work on a sample of what the research catalog optimistically called stabilized vacuum energy. "The most advanced thing you can do is understand the fundamentals so completely that you don't need advanced tools to achieve advanced results." The vacuum energy sample was perhaps the most challenging material he had yet attempted to work with. It was, in the most literal sense, structured nothingness, quantum fluctuations that had been convinced to maintain coherence through exotic field manipulations. Conventional wisdom held that such materials could only be influenced through equally exotic techniques, but David had learned to trust his grandfather's philosophy. Every material, no matter how exotic, followed principles that could be understood and worked with rather than against. His approach to vacuum energy required tools even more primitive than usual. Stone and iron contained too much substance to effectively interact with structured nothingness. Instead, David had prepared implements made from carefully shaped shadows, areas where light had been systematically excluded to create tools that existed as much through absence as presence. "The theory," he explained to his fascinated audience as he began his careful work, "is that vacuum energy responds better to structured absence than to structured presence. Instead of trying to impose shape through force, I'm creating patterns of nothingness that encourage the material to organize itself around them." The technique was almost meditative in its subtlety. David moved his shadow tools through complex patterns that created resonances in the quantum foam, encouraging the vacuum energy to stabilize into increasingly sophisticated structures. Each movement had to be precisely calculated. Too much presence, and the structured nothingness would collapse back into random quantum fluctuations. Too little, and nothing would happen at all. Around the workshop, students and faculty watched in amazement as something impossible unfolded before them. The vacuum energy sample was responding to David's techniques, organizing itself into patterns that exhibited the characteristics of solid matter while remaining composed entirely of structured nothingness. The result was a blade that could cut through virtually any substance while having no mass or physical presence of its own. "Extraordinary," breathed Chancellor Vexandra, who had arrived to observe this latest demonstration. You have created a weapon from pure possibility, shaped nothingness into functional form. Our most advanced theoretical physicists have been attempting such applications for millennia. David stepped back from his work, examining the vacuum energy blade that existed as a perfect absence in the shape of possibility. It was, by any reasonable measure, impossible, a functional tool created from the spaces between atoms, the pauses between thoughts, the potential that existed in the moment before action. I couldn't have done it without everything I learned from working with conventional materials first, he said, setting aside his shadow tools with the careful precision that had become second nature. Each material teaches you something about the nature of reality. Iron taught me about persistence and gradual change. Titanium showed me the relationship between stress and strength. The exotic materials revealed how the most unusual properties often respond to the most basic approaches. He gestured toward the vacuum energy blade that seemed to bend light around itself in patterns that suggested depth without substance. But this one taught me something different. It taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create space for something to become itself. The workshop fell silent as the implications of David's statement settled over the assembled minds. In a galaxy where technological advancement was typically measured by the ability to fill space with increasingly sophisticated structures, the human had achieved unprecedented results by learning to shape emptiness itself. The applications, whispered Dr. Thainvex from Strategic Technologies, could revolutionize everything from space travel to communications. Matter that has no mass but possesses functional properties could enable faster-than-light transmission, zero-energy manufacturing, possibly even temporal manipulation. Around the workshop, representatives from various civilizations were already beginning to discuss the commercial and military implications of David's latest breakthrough, but David himself seemed more interested in the philosophical aspects of what he had achieved. My grandfather used to say that the most important part of any tool is the space around it, he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone of someone processing new understanding even as he spoke. The blade is defined by the emptiness it creates when it cuts. The hammer's power comes from the space it moves through before impact. Maybe the most advanced technologies are those that understand how to work with emptiness as skillfully as they work with matter. Over the following year, the Thompson Institute became the focal point for materials research from across the galaxy. David's techniques were systematized, scaled up, and integrated with existing technologies in ways that revolutionized entire industries. Starship hulls became lighter and stronger. Weapons achieved unprecedented efficiency. Manufacturing processes that had required enormous energy inputs learned to work with materials' natural tendencies rather than against them. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than technological. The Academy's student body, once rigidly divided along species and technological lines, had become genuinely collaborative. David's demonstration that the most primitive techniques could achieve the most sophisticated results had challenged everyone's assumptions about the relationship between advancement and effectiveness. "The thing about David," Cathrax said during one of their regular evening discussions in the workshop, "is that he didn't just show us new techniques, he showed us a different way of thinking about problems." The group that gathered for these informal sessions had grown to include students from every major species represented at the Academy, along with faculty members and visiting researchers who found the discussions as valuable as formal lectures. Before David arrived, Velnara added, her harmonized voice carrying notes of philosophical reflection, we all approached materials science as a form of conquest. We developed more powerful tools, more sophisticated techniques, more advanced technologies to impose our will on reluctant matter. But David's approach is more like diplomacy, continued Zilnoth, whose family's manufacturing empire had begun incorporating feedback-based techniques with remarkable success. He negotiates with materials, finds compromises that serve both the craftsman's intentions and the matter's natural preferences. David listened to these discussions with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The techniques that his grandfather had considered simple common sense were being analyzed by some of the most sophisticated minds in the galaxy as revolutionary innovations. The workshop principles that had seemed ordinary back home were being hailed as paradigm-shifting philosophies. "I think maybe," he said during one particularly thoughtful evening, "the real innovation isn't in the techniques themselves. It's in remembering that technology is supposed to serve understanding rather than replace it." He gestured toward the display cases that now housed examples of his work with various exotic materials, blades forged from everything from simple iron to structured vacuum energy, each one representing a different aspect of the relationship between craftsman and material. Every one of these taught me something different about the nature of reality. Iron showed me persistence. Titanium demonstrated the relationship between stress and strength. The neutronium composite revealed how exotic properties could be stabilized through patient application of basic principles. The dark matter blade taught me that time itself could be shaped through understanding rather than force. His voice took on the cadences of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about these concepts. But the vacuum energy blade showed me something that I think might be the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can create is space for something else to exist. Around the workshop, his audience nodded with the recognition of individuals who had spent months learning to see their own fields of expertise through David's unique perspective. The human's techniques had become more than manufacturing innovations. They had become a way of approaching problems that emphasized cooperation over domination, understanding over force, patience over speed. "The question now," said Master Thekvar, who had become one of David's most enthusiastic collaborators, "is how these principles might be applied beyond material science. If diplomatic approaches work better than conquest approaches for shaping matter, what might they accomplish in other areas of endeavor?" The question opened new avenues of discussion that extended far beyond metallurgy. Representatives from the Academy's diplomatic corps had begun attending the evening sessions, curious about whether David's negotiation-based approaches might be applicable to interspecies relations. Military strategists wondered if cooperation-focused tactics might achieve better results than domination-focused ones. Even economists were interested in whether understanding-based approaches might be more effective than force-based ones for managing galactic trade relationships. "I think," David said one evening as the discussion turned to these broader applications, "my grandfather would be amazed to know that his workshop philosophy might end up influencing galactic civilization." He paused, looking around at the diverse group of minds that had gathered to explore these ideas. Students, faculty, researchers, and visitors representing dozens of different species and countless different perspectives, all united by curiosity about approaches that emphasized understanding over domination. But I also think he would have said that good principles tend to be universal. If something works in one area, it probably works in others too. The specific techniques might be different, but the underlying philosophy stays the same. As the Academy's academic year drew to a close, David found himself facing a choice that would have seemed impossible when he first arrived as an unknown student from a primitive backwater world. Universities across the galaxy were offering him positions. Corporations wanted to license his techniques. Governments were interested in consulting relationships that could provide strategic advantages in materials development. But perhaps the most intriguing offer came from the Galactic Council itself, which had established a new position specifically for him, Director of Applied Understanding, with a mandate to explore how cooperation-based approaches might be implemented across various aspects of interspecies relations. "Student Thompson," Chancellor Vexandra said during their final formal meeting, Your time at this academy has been unprecedented in every measurable way. You arrived as an unknown quantity from a species that most considered technologically primitive. You leave as the originator of techniques that are revolutionizing multiple fields of study and the philosophical advocate for approaches that may reshape how our civilization thinks about problem solving. David nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of changes that had grown from his simple desire to complete a class assignment using familiar techniques. The question now, the Chancellor continued, is how you wish to apply the understanding you have developed. The opportunities available to you are essentially unlimited. David looked out through the Academy's crystalline walls toward the three suns that had witnessed his transformation from curious student to galactic innovator. In the distance, he could see starships arriving and departing, vessels that now incorporated materials created using techniques he had learned in his grandfather's workshop on a small world that most galactic citizens couldn't locate on a star chart. "Chancellor," he said finally, "my grandfather used to tell me that the best way to honor knowledge is to share it as widely as possible. I think maybe the most important thing I can do is help other people discover that the most sophisticated solutions often grow from the most fundamental understanding." He paused, considering the various opportunities that lay before him. The specific position matters less than the ability to continue exploring how cooperation-based approaches might be applied to problems that force-based approaches haven't been able to solve. The Chancellor's ancient form displayed patterns that David had learned indicated deep approval. "A wise perspective, Student Thompson," or perhaps I should say, Director Thompson, since that appears to be your preferred path forward. As David prepared to leave the academy that had become his second home, he took one final walk through the workshop where his techniques had first captured galactic attention. The fusion forges still hummed with barely contained stellar fire, ready to impose human will on reluctant matter through overwhelming force. But next to them sat simpler workstations where students were learning to achieve equally impressive results through patient cooperation with materials' natural tendencies. On his workbench, he left behind the tools that had started everything, a piece of napped flint and a work-hardened iron striker, simple implements that had somehow managed to challenge the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. Attached was a note written in the precise script his grandfather had taught him. For the next student who thinks that understanding might be more powerful than force, and that the best tools are those that help you listen to what the work is trying to teach you. As his transport lifted away from the academy, David could see through the viewport that the workshop lights were still burning. Somewhere below, students from dozens of different worlds were experimenting with combinations of ancient techniques and cutting-edge technologies, learning that the most sophisticated results often grew from the most fundamental principles. His grandfather would have been proud.